It's great to welcome to the program today Tyler Cowen, who is professor of economics at George Mason University and also author of the book The Complacent Class: The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream. It's so great to talk to you. I just finished the book yesterday, in fact, and it really approaches much of what is going on in American economics and culture from a number of different angles. And I think maybe a good place to start is when you talk about complacency, what are we talking about, and how can we see this complacency in Americans?
Our society has become less dynamic. The American frontier is gone. Real wages are rising at slower rates. The rate at which Americans move across state lines to find, say, a new job, it's much slower than it used to be. We obsess over the safety of our kids, and we medicate ourselves much, much more. We've become a society obsessed with stasis and safety.
And is that a result of something in particular that's going on in the United States, or is it something that we could point to in other countries as they achieve a certain level of, call it wealth, call it stability, whatever the case may be? Is that sort of a natural process that happens in countries?
It's a natural process. You see very much the same in most of Western Europe, also in Japan, but I do think there are some special factors to the United States. This is the society where the internet has advanced the most. And a lot of what the internet does is it makes it very easy for us to stay at home. So we post on social media instead of protesting. Amazon delivers whatever we want. We can sit on our sofas and watch Netflix. And all this contributes to today being a kind of age of complacency.
Can we see this reflected in terms of innovation, small businesses? Are there particular industries where this is particularly noticeable right now?
Well, most of the American economy, so the rate of business startups has been declining since the 1980s, contrary to what you often hear. There are fewer unicorns than before. Measured indices of market power or monopoly power, those are higher. Figures for investment are sluggish. Figures for productivity growth are definitely down. So our tech sector in some ways is very dynamic, but most of our economy still is not tech. It's fairly static retail or services. And you see this reflected in real wages, which for most American families on average have not been growing since 1999.
There's one interesting factor you discuss in the book, which is that segregation by income has increased in most parts of the United States. You see wealthier people tending to live together more, poorer people tending to live together more. Is that a factor that, in your mind, increases complacency, or one that actually might, by virtue of inequality, make people maybe more upset with the status quo and more likely to activate in some way?
So far, it's made complacency worse. So if you look at our cities, a lot of them are gentrifying. So you have more people who are, say, yuppies or educated professionals living together. This makes mobility harder. It's harder for other people to break into those cities and use that as an economic ladder upwards. I think in the longer run, this may cause a kind of social explosion. But for now, if you live in one of those cities, things seem pretty great and pretty calm, and crime rates often are falling. But it's actually a kind of symbol of our longer run decay, that poorer people are clustered together living somewhere else, and we simply don't see them so much.
What do you see as or do you see, or through what mechanism might that trend eventually sort of implode, as you're sort of suggesting, and create fallout in some sense? Would it be an economic recession? Would it be further inequality? What type of factor might cause that sequence to start?
I think further declines in mobility. So the older American notion that at will you could move to a big city and work your way up, and in the meantime pay a reasonable rent, that's pretty much dead today. And again, in the short run, that feels like maybe unfortunate, but something we can live with. But I think if you have 2 or 3 generations in a row where upward mobility keeps on falling, there is eventually some kind of point of an explosion or an implosion. I don't quite feel we're there yet. But there's much more credentialism in American society. Many more jobs need licenses, or you might need a master's degree. And all of these overall, they're mostly bad for poorer people. They're bad for social and economic mobility.
You talk in the book, and you just mentioned sort of geographic mobility, the idea of moving maybe from a rural area to a city for a job. You also talk in the book quite a bit towards the beginning, I believe it is, about how it has become less and less common for people in the US to move long distances for jobs. That's
That's
a
right.
really interesting part of the book to me because in many other parts of the world, like for example, I'm from Argentina and a lot of my family there will talk to me about how it seems like in the US, so many people live on the other side of the country than where they grew up or where their parents live or whatever the case may be. It's sometimes seen as sort of a less nice thing from the point of view of a cohesive family unit. But you point to the decreased mobility in terms of moving for jobs as actually a negative indicator of where things are going. Can you talk about that a little bit?
The rate at which Americans move across state lines is down about 50% compared to its post-war average. I think this is a very bad symptom. It's basically suggesting there are not many parts of the country that are growing very dynamically. There's Silicon Valley, but most people don't have the skills to work there, or you can't afford the rent. And otherwise, like, why bother moving from Columbus, Ohio to Denver or vice versa? You see a lot of people, they move once, they figure out where they want to live, they stay there. Again, in the short run, that's very comfortable. But in the longer run, it essentially means that our labor markets are slower to adjust, our economy is less dynamic, we've given up this earlier American frontier mentality, and it's again contributing to stasis and complacency.
Is it risk aversion that you would characterize as one of these sort of rising contributors to this from an individual perspective? I know we've talked about, and you talk about in the book, a lot of the sort of country or maybe macro level factors that have contributed. But from the point of view of the individual, how does risk aversion play into this?
A lot of it's risk aversion, like why pick up and move to a new area when you're not sure what's there. But I think a lot of it is just a smoothing out across regions. A lot of America is more the same than it used to be. Amazon will deliver anywhere you want. Retail malls in different parts of the country, they feel the same. You can be a dentist in many parts of the country. So the overall picture is simply one where the reasons to move have gone down and the desire has gone down too.
You talk in the book about other sort of technological factors that relate to better matching. And by matching, we mean that it's very easy to go directly in the romantic world, for example, to dating people that you've already matched with to a greater degree than someone you might randomly encounter on public transit. You are increasingly able to in the work world, have better matching that will keep you in comfortable situations. Social media has played a big role in this. You've got Spotify and Pandora. You might never even have to hear a song you don't like. Just that in all areas, there's this sort of bubble of comfort that has developed. How is that something that takes away one's maybe incentive or drive to do something that is more risky in some way?
Well, it does have a big upside, especially for people who match well. But think about couples and marriage. There are many more power couples than ever before.
Mhm.
And of course, a lot of these families are happy. We shouldn't begrudge that. But the longer run impact of this on inequality and mobility, I think, will be significant. You'll have much larger bequests. You'll have both the husband and the wife, or the two men or the two women in a same-sex marriage, both having very high incomes and contributing those financial resources to the children. So it's really great for those at the top, and those at the bottom who are trying to climb up will find they're having a harder time.
We've been speaking about the book, The Complacent Class, The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream, with the book's author, Tyler Cowen. We'll pause there and continue our conversation with him on tomorrow's program. We're continuing our conversation with Tyler Cowen, who's professor of economics at George Mason University, also author of the book, The Complacent Class, The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream. So in the first part of the interview, we talked about some of the characteristics that allow us to see this complacency that you describe in the book. We also talked a little bit about what has caused it. I want to focus now on the possible impacts and consequences. And at the end of the book, you talk about national security. You talk about a number of other factors that you believe over the long term will be affected by the complacency that you've identified. Let's start there. Over the next 10, 20, 50 years, how will the United States be impacted by this growing complacency that you've described?
Well, let's look at our government. What we find when you examine the federal budget is that each year more and more of it is taken up by expenditures that are locked in. Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. Now, I'm not at all saying we shouldn't have these programs, but we're taking less and less of tax revenue and devoting it toward research and development, toward discretionary spending, toward infrastructure. We're taking fewer chances. We're spending more and more of our money on just protecting the positions people already have and insulating them from risk.
Hmm.
This is very different from what we did, say, in the 1960s, and I feel it's a big mistake. So, in the longer run, what will happen is our government is losing the ability to respond flexibly to crises or to come up with the next moonshot or invent the next big development as it once did with nuclear power. So that to me is very concerning.
And is that, I mean, I think we can all imagine how that leads directly into the national security concerns of a country in the sort of stasis that you describe.
That's right. And the notion that America might have to do something where American soldiers suffer casualties, that's become extremely unpopular. We fight wars by drone. And again, in any single instance, that feels maybe comfortable or like the right thing to do.
Hmm.
But I worry that we're losing our ability to deter. Our allies do not trust us much anymore. And our influence and projection of power in the world, I see that as going down rapidly.
Yeah, the military thing is an interesting one because we had layer one of sort of the average American being removed from what the military is doing by virtue of not needing a draft here in the United States. You've got an all volunteer military. So it's very easy for most Americans never to even think about what the military is doing. Now you've got layer two of that removal, which is the increased use of drones and distance warfare. Do you think that that also is part of this sort of comfort bubble that you describe in the book?
Very much so. And arguably, the next generation of war will be cyber warfare, which is yet another kind of removal.
Hmm.
And I feel when it comes to that, like as long as the internet is working today, we don't see a problem. But we're courting the next 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. And I think at some point there will be a major cyber attack on American assets or institutions. And we're basically not at all ready for that. We just think life is fine now. It can't really happen to us. It's a big mistake.
What do you see in developing countries in terms of factors that cause this complacency not to be there? Is it simply the need for self-preservation and staying alive due to a far reduced standard of living? Are there other more intangible factors?
I think the whole attitude toward risk is very different. So in the book, I give the example of China.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying the US should be like China, but the attitude is, well, if you don't go out and take some chances, risk will come and get you. So people are very proactive and very aggressive. And I think at least at the margin, we should learn something from that. And you see Chinese immigrants, when they come to this country, they do very well. And in part, it's because they're carrying that attitude with them. I would say overall, immigrants are the least complacent people in American society right now.
Yeah, and in the book you also talk about, I mean, not just Chinese immigrants, but and this actually relates a lot to stereotypes that we often hear from elected officials or political pundits or whoever about lazy immigrants leeching off of social welfare programs. The evidence doesn't really back up that caricature, does it?
Correct. And Latinos and Mexicans, Mexican Americans, they're the group most likely to move around the country in search of a new job, far more likely than, say, native-born non-Latino Americans. And that's to their credit. It's very dynamic. It's
Now, do you
commendable.
think that that's as a result of them being from particular countries or more related to their status in the United States as new immigrants?
I think the fact that they came here means they're risk takers to begin with. They're accustomed to the idea of moving. They don't find it some unthinkable shock. Obviously, they don't necessarily have strong ties to the first part of the United States they've come to settle in. And if someone says, hey, there's a better job for you in Chicago, I think their attitude is, why not? Let's try it. They can always go back, say, to Mexico or Central America. That's a very healthy attitude.
When it comes to political decisions that are made by whoever's in the White House, whoever's in charge in the House of Representatives or the Senate, are the differences between Democrats and Republicans in terms of how they will impact this broader stasis and complacency even noticeable, or is this an area in which all of our elected officials are quite similar in terms of whether they would even change the status quo you describe?
I think in a funny way, they're quite similar. So anyone who watches politics, you see at the rhetorical level, there has not been so much polarization for a long time. What the Trump people say, the Clinton people say, it all sounds so horrible. They attack each other. But when you get right down to what's likely to happen with the budget, say the failure of the Republicans to roll back Obamacare, whether you agree with that or not, I think we see we're living in a time of stasis where not many things change. And on fundamentals, there's a lot more agreement across the two parties. We're actually just not really going to do very much. The visions of Trump make America great again, very backward looking. Hillary Clinton was backward looking to the 90s and to the Obama administration.
Hmm.
A big contrast with, say, JFK, who talked all about the new frontier.
What's an example of the type of policy that a president could actually possibly propose and affect that would change the direction that you identify in the book?
More money for research and development with our infrastructure to get that moving again. And I don't just mean repairing roads and tunnels, though that's fine, but to do something like help implement the smart grid or introduce more online education.
Hmm.
We need to make it much easier for poorer people to move into cities. So deregulate building in those cities to some extent. There's a lot we could do. I think the key point is neither party seems that interested in actually doing it. It's a fair amount of talk, but very little action on either side.
Yeah, that may be. I mean, at the same time, what you're talking about, there's no guarantee that we would see it from a Republican or a Democrat, but it certainly sounds to me like something, at least more like the language you'd hear from Democrats, don't you think?
Yes, but keep in mind, Democrats also want to expand a lot of other parts of the budget, entitlement spending,
Hmm.
and that will tend to crowd out the possibility of these programs. So, you can debate, which party you prefer or on
Sure.
social issues, but I think in the longer run, it's actually going to look fairly similar once you get past all the rhetoric.
Have you given any thought to the impact of such significant defense spending on the way we more generally allocate resources and the stasis and complacency that you describe, partially from the idea that we could maybe increase complacency by knowing that we've got this massive military industrial complex and that so much money is tied up in bombs and defense and so on and so forth? What's your sense about that?
I think people feel quite safe. They feel, in a sense, too safe. They're neglecting perhaps cyber attack. But what will happen is as we continue to age, it will cost more and more money to sustain people in their older years, which I'm all for doing. But it will mean a lot of pressure on the defense budget, a lot of our capabilities, infrastructure. You see that eroding already. It's been the case for some time. Our Navy getting weaker in relative terms.
Hmm.
And that's the likely trend. It's just kind of upkeep and innovation in a lot of areas other than maintaining the elderly. We see those already going down.
You talk about China in the book, as you described, and China's circumstances are quite different than those of the United States. Have you identified any country that is more at the level of development or wealth that is the United States, but that has policies that you would find to be better policies for fighting stasis and complacency?
I think both Canada and Australia have somewhat better policies than we do. Those were countries that were once poorer than America. Now they're each slightly better off and they're better governed. So we could learn some things from them. I would start with those two places. But for the most part, complacency has come to most other wealthy countries.
What about the role of healthcare? I mean, I know it's interesting you mentioned Canada and Australia, both of which were recently ranked in a study of 12 wealthier nations, more developed nations, as having some of the better healthcare systems in terms of their effectiveness. They do not have these sort of employer-connected for-profit healthcare systems of the United States. Does that play a role here?
That plays a role. With respect to America, I think it's one of these you can't get there from here stories. So if we had had better policy, say in 1972, you could imagine American healthcare right now being much cheaper. But given how much we pay, to think that will cut those payments to doctors and medical devices and hospitals, it's very hard for me to see that happening. So I think we're stuck in this box where for us, truly universal coverage would be very costly. People demand it. They're not really sure how to get it. People now want more single payer. But in terms of actually footing the bill, I don't think we're close to any kind of consensus.
No, no consensus, but have you seen some of the analyses, like, for example, by Gerald Friedman at the University of Massachusetts on sort of debunking or
Yes.
attempting to debunk the idea that we can't afford that?
I don't think we can afford it unless the American public would raise its collective hands and say, well, I'm willing to accept a 5%, say, VAT tax on
Hmm.
everything I spend. Whether or not they should do that, you can debate. But I don't see any willingness at all to, face up to those costs and say, okay, let's do it. It's all thought of in terms of a free lunch. Like somehow, if we have single payer, these costs will magically fall. But Medicare is a kind of single payer for the elderly. That's still a pretty expensive system, much more than what Canada or Australia spends
Yes,
insuring its elderly.
that's true. Very, very interesting conversation, and I highly recommend the book, which is, of course, The Complacent Class, The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream. Economics professor Tyler Cowen is the book's author. Thanks so much for talking to us about this.
My pleasure. Thank you.